My foster parents beat me until I lost consciousness, after which I was transferred to another family. But then, my former parents sued my new parents, and we won the case. I don't know where to start, but I guess the beginning is as good a place as any. I'm sitting here, staring at this blinking cursor, wondering how much of my life I should lay bare to strangers on the internet. But something inside me, something that has been buried under years of pain and fear, says that maybe, just maybe, it's time to let it all out. I was born in a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business, but no one really knew mine. I was adopted at a young age, too young to remember my real parents, and I was brought into a home that should have been a safe haven, but was anything but. My adoptive parents, whom I'll call James and Linda for the sake of this post, were the kind of people who wore their best faces in public, but were monsters behind closed doors. James was a tall, imposing man with a booming voice that could send shivers down your spine. He was a strict disciplinarian, or at least that's what he called it. To me, it felt more like living under the constant threat of a storm that could break at any moment. Linda, on the other hand, was a small, wiry woman with a face that looked like it was carved out of stone. She rarely spoke, but when she did, her words cut like knives. Together, they created a household that was more like a prison than a home. I can't remember a time when I wasn't scared. As far back as I can recall, there was always something to fear. The first memory that stands out in my mind is from when I was about 5 years old. I had accidentally knocked over a vase in the living room, a hideous thing that I'm pretty sure they got from a garage sale. It wasn't even valuable, but you would have thought it'd smashed the Mona Lisa. James dragged me by the arm into the basement, a dark, damp place that smelled of mildew and fear. He didn't just scold me, he beat me until I couldn't stand. Linda stood at the top of the stairs, watching with cold, unfeeling eyes, as if this was just another Tuesday night. This was how they raised me. Any mistake, any misstep, was met with violence. James used whatever was at Honda belt, a stick, his fists. Linda wasn't much better. She had this way of making you feel like you were the lowest form of life on the planet. She didn't need to hit her words were enough. "You're worthless," she'd say. "You're lucky we took you in. No one else would want a piece of trash like you." And for the longest time, I believed her. School was my only escape, though it wasn't much better. I was the weird kid, the one with the bruises that I tried to hide under long sleeves, the one who never smiled. The teachers must have noticed, but no one ever said anything. Maybe they were too busy, or maybe they just didn't care. The other kids, though, they saw me. Some were bullies who took advantage of my already broken spirit to kick me when I was down, both literally and figuratively. But there were a few, just a few, who showed me kindness. There was one boy, Matt, who seemed to see right through the walls I put up. He was everything I wasn't: confident, popular, and carefree. But for some reason, he took an interest in me. I remember the first time he talked to me. We were in the 3rd grade, and I was sitting alone at recess, as usual, trying to make myself as small and invisible as possible. Matt just walked up and sat down next to me, like it was the most natural thing in the world. He didn't say much, just asked if I wanted to play. I was too stunned to say anything, so I just nodded. From that day on, he made it his mission to include me, to make sure I wasn't alone. Looking back, I think Matt knew something was wrong at home. He never asked about the bruises, but he also never made fun of me for them. He was the first real friend I ever had, and for a while things got a little better. I started to believe that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't as worthless as Linda always said. But the good times didn't last. They never did. One night, when I was about 10, I overheard James and Linda talking after they thought I was asleep. They were arguing about money, something they did often, but this time it was different. James was yelling about how much of a burden I was, how they never should have adopted me. Linda agreed, saying I was just another mouth to feed, a drain on their already stretched finances. That night, I cried myself to sleep, feeling more alone than I ever had before. Even the people who were supposed to love me didn't want me. The abuse got worse after that. James seemed to take out all his frustrations on me, and Linda's coldness turned into outright hostility. I remember one time when I got a B on a test to B. Not even a fan James lost it. He said I was too stupid to be his son and threw me down the stairs. I broke my arm that day, but we didn't go to the hospital. Linda just said it herself, muttering under her breath about how weak I was. The physical pain was bad, but it was the emotional pain that cut the deepest. I started to believe that I really was worthless, that I was just a burden that no one wanted. I withdrew even further into myself, barely speaking unless spoken to. I stopped hanging out with Matt and the other kids who had tried to befriend me. I didn't want to drag them down with me. I became a ghost, floating through life, unseen and unheard. High school was supposed to be a fresh start, but it was just more of the same. I kept my head down, did my work, and tried to stay out of trouble. But trouble always seemed to find me. I was smaller than most of the other guys, and that made me an easy target. The bullies didn't even need a reason, they just liked picking on the weak. I got into fights, not because I wanted to, but because I had no choice. I wasn't strong, but I learned how to take a punch. I learned how to hide the bruises so that James wouldn't notice and accuse me of causing more trouble. He didn't need much of an excuse to start swinging. But even in the darkest times, there were glimmers of hope. There were a few teachers who seemed to care, who noticed when I didn't have lunch money or when I couldn't concentrate in class. They never asked directly, but they would slip me a couple of dollars or let me sit in their classroom during lunch. I know now that they were trying to help in the only way they could, without overstepping their bounds. But back then, I didn't understand. I just thought they were being nice. The real turning point came in my senior year of high school. By then, I had gotten pretty good at hiding my home life from everyone. But one day, I couldn't hide it anymore. I had stayed after school to work on a project, and when I got home, James was waiting for me. He was drunk, more drunk than I'd ever seen him. He accused me of being out with friends, of doing drugs, of all sorts of things that weren't true. When I tried to explain, he hit me so hard that I blacked out. When I came to, I was in the hospital. A neighbor had heard the commotion and called 911. I had a concussion, a couple of broken ribs, and more bruises than I could count. The doctors and nurses looked at me with a mix of pity and anger, and I knew that this time, there would be no hiding what had happened. Child Protective Services got involved, and for the first time in my life, I felt like maybe, just maybe, things would get better. But it was a long road. I was placed in foster care, and while it wasn't perfect, it was better than where I had been. I finished high school and was determined to get out of that town, to start a new life where no one knew me or my past. I applied to every college I could think of, desperate for an escape. When the acceptance letter came from a university several states away, I cried for the first time in years. Not because I was sad, but because I was finally free. University was supposed to be my fresh start, and in many ways it was. I threw myself into my studies, determined to prove to myself and to the world that I was more than what James and Linda had tried to make me. But the shadows of my past were always there, lurking just beneath the surface. I made friends, but I kept them at arm's length. I couldn't shake the fear that if they knew the real me, the me that had been beaten and broken for so many years, they would turn away. I smiled and laughed with them, but there was always a part of me that was still that scared little boy hiding in the basement. But despite everything, I succeeded. I graduated with honors, something I never would have thought possible. I walked across that stage with my head held high, feeling for the first time in my life like I had actually accomplished something. After I was released from the hospital, Child Protective Services placed me with a new family, a foster family, that was unlike anything I had ever known. I was hesitant at first, wary of getting too comfortable or trusting too much. After all, the only family I had ever known had been a nightmare. But this new family, the Carters, slowly began to chip away at the walls I had built around myself. The Carters lived in a cozy two-story house in a quiet neighborhood. Tom and Susan Carter were in their early 50s, with 2 grown children who had moved out years ago. They had been foster parents for a long time, taking in kids who needed a safe place to stay. When I first arrived, I was nervous. I had spent so long being told that I was worthless that I didn't know how to handle people who actually cared. Susan was the first to approach me. She was a warm, motherly woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. She welcomed me into their home with open arms, telling me that I was safe now, that I didn't need to be afraid anymore. Tom, her husband, was a quiet man, but there was something comforting about his presence. He didn't say much, but when he did, his words were always thoughtful and reassuring. The Carters didn't press me for details about my past. They let me settle in at my own pace, giving me the space I needed to adjust. They never asked why I flinched when someone raised their voice, or why I avoided eye contact. Instead, they focused on making me feel welcome, on showing me that their home was a place where I could finally relax and be myself. For the first few weeks, I kept to myself. I spent most of my time in the room they had given me, a small but comfortable space with a bed, a desk, and a window that looked out over the backyard. At night, I would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the other shoe to drop. I was convinced that this kindness was just a facade, that eventually they would show their true colors. But as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, I began to realize that maybe, just maybe, the Carters were different. They never raised their voices, never got angry over small mistakes. When I accidentally spilled a glass of water at dinner, Susan simply smiled and handed me a towel, telling me it was no big deal. When I got a C on a math test, Tom sat down with me to help me study, rather than scolding me for not being smart enough. Slowly, the fear that had been my constant companion began to fade, replaced by a tentative sense of trust. It was around this time that I reconnected with an old friend, someone I hadn't seen since I was a kid, back when my life was dominated by fear and pain. His name was Matt, the boy who had once taken an interest in me during elementary school, back when I was too scared and withdrawn to make many friends. One day, as I was walking through the neighborhood, I noticed a familiar figure coming out of a nearby house. It took me a moment to recognize him. He had grown taller, filled out with the muscle of someone who had spent a lot of time outdoors, but there was no mistaking that easy smile. "Matt," I called out, more out of instinct than anything else. He turned, and for a moment, we just stared at each other. Then recognition dawned on his face, and he broke into a wide grin. "No way! Is that really you?" he asked, walking over with the same confident stride I remembered from all those years ago. I nodded, still in a bit of shock. "Yeah, it's me. It's been a long time." We stood there, awkward for a moment, before Matt pulled me into a tight hug. It was the kind of embrace I hadn't experienced in years, warm, genuine, and full of a connection that hadn't been lost despite the time apart. "I thought you moved away or something," Matt said once he released me, his eyes still scanning me as if he couldn't believe I was real. "I did, kind of," I replied, not sure how much to tell him, "but I'm back now." Matt didn't press for details, which I appreciated. Instead, he invited me over to his house for a drink, and we spent the next few hours catching up. I told him about my time in high school, the difficulties I faced, and how I had managed to graduate and get accepted into a university despite everything. He shared his own stories, and I was amazed at how much he had accomplished. He had stayed in our hometown, working odd jobs and taking care of his younger siblings after his parents divorced. It hadn't been easy for him either, but he had gotten through it with the same determination that I remembered from our childhood. As we talked, the idea of going to university together came up. Matt hadn't gone to college right after high school. He had been too busy helping out at home, but he had always wanted to study business. He had a natural talent for organizing and managing things, and I knew he would excel in a management program. "What do you say we give it a shot?" Matt asked, his eyes alight with excitement. "We could apply together, start fresh. It would be like old times, but better." I hesitated for a moment, but then I realized that this was exactly what I needed. I had already gone through university once, but I hadn't had anyone by my side, no one to share the experience with. Reconnecting with Matt felt like a second chance, a chance to do things right, to build something meaningful with someone who had always had my back. So we applied together, both of us entering the same management program at a university a few hours away. When our acceptance letters came, it felt like the beginning of something new, something hopeful. The Carters were overjoyed when they found out I had been accepted to university again, especially since I would be going with Matt. Susan cried when she saw the acceptance letter, pulling me into a tight hug and telling me how proud she was. Tom, in his usual quiet way, simply smiled and gave me a firm handshake, the pride in his eyes speaking louder than words. The summer before we left for university was a strange time. I was excited about the future, but also nervous about what lay ahead. I had spent so long just trying to survive that I wasn't sure how to handle the idea of actually thriving. But with the Carters' support and Matt by my side, I felt like I could finally start to breathe, to let go of the fear that had haunted me for so long. When we arrived at the university, Matt and I were assigned to the same dorm building, though we had different roommates. The campus was huge, filled with students rushing to classes, groups hanging out on the quad, and the constant buzz of activity. It was overwhelming at first, but I quickly adapted, finding comfort in the routine of classes and studying. Matt and I continued to spend most of our time together, though we also made new friends. One of those friends was Emily, a sharp-witted girl with a passion for history and a love for all things vintage. We met her in one of our business classes, and the three of us quickly became inseparable. It was Emily who first introduced us to the world of antiques. She had a part-time job at a small antique shop near campus, and one day she invited us to check it out. The shop was a treasure trove of old furniture, vintage jewelry, and dusty books that seemed to hold the secrets of the past. I was fascinated by the history behind each item, the stories that they seemed to whisper as I walked through the aisles. Matt and I started hanging out at the shop more often, and eventually we began helping out with small tasks, moving furniture, cleaning, and organizing. The owner, an elderly man named Mr. Collins, was happy to have the extra help and didn't mind if we spent our free time browsing the inventory. It wasn't long before we started talking about the possibility of starting our own business. Matt was the first to bring it up, tossing out the idea as we were walking back to our dorm one evening. "Why don't we open our own antique shop?" he said, his eyes lighting up with excitement. "We could make it a real business, something that could grow into something big." I was hesitant at first. The idea of starting a business seemed daunting, especially since we were still in university and didn't have much money. But the more we talked about it, the more the idea began to take shape in my mind. I had always been drawn to the stories behind the antiques, and the thought of making a living out of something I was passionate about was too tempting to ignore. We spent the next few months planning and researching, figuring out what it would take to turn our dream into a reality. Emily was on board from the start, using her connections and knowledge to help us navigate the world of antiques. She had a knack for finding hidden gems, pieces that others might overlook, but that had real value. The three of us pooled our savings, took out a small loan, and rented a tiny storefront in a quiet part of town. It wasn't much a single room with a creaky wooden floor and a window that rattled in the wind, but it was ours. We named it Forgotten Treasures, a nod to the stories that each item in the shop held. The early days were tough. We had to juggle classes, homework, and running the business, all while trying to build a customer base. There were days when I wondered if we had made a mistake, if we had taken on more than we could handle. But every time I walked into the shop and saw the items we had carefully selected, I knew that this was what I wanted to do. We started by selling small items, vintage jewelry, old postcards, and other knickknacks that we could find at estate sales and flea markets. Emily handled the sourcing, using her connections to find unique pieces that would catch the eye of potential buyers. Matt focused on marketing, using social media and word of mouth to spread the word about our shop. I took care of the day-to-day operations, managing the inventory, keeping the books, and making sure everything ran smoothly. Business was slow at first, but we gradually began to build a loyal customer base. People started coming in regularly, drawn by the unique items we had for sale and the friendly atmosphere we had created. We made it a point to learn the stories behind each piece so that we could share them with our customers. It wasn't just about selling antiques, it was about connecting people with the past, with memories that they could take home with them. As the business grew, so did our confidence. We started expanding our inventory, buying larger items like furniture and artwork. We even began offering restoration services, thanks to Emily's expertise and the skills we had picked up along the way. We hired a few part-time employees to help out, and before we knew it, Forgotten Treasures had become a staple in the community. But as much as I loved the business, there were still moments when my past would creep up on me, when the shadows of my childhood would cast a pall over the happiness I had found. There were nights when I couldn't sleep, haunted by memories of James and Linda, of the fear that had been my constant companion for so long. It was during one of those sleepless nights that I found myself sitting in the shop, alone, surrounded by the objects that I had come to love. The shop was dark, illuminated only by the faint glow of the streetlights outside. I sat at the counter, staring at an old photograph we had recently acquired, a black and white image of a family from the 1940s, smiling together in front of their home. I couldn't help but wonder what their lives had been like. Had they been happy? Had they loved each other? Or had they hidden their pain behind those smiles, just as I had hidden mine for so many years? As I sat there, lost in thought, the door to the shop creaked open. I looked up to see Susan standing in the doorway, her face lined with concern. "I saw the light on," she said softly, stepping inside and closing the door behind her. "Are you okay?" I nodded, though I wasn't sure if I was telling the truth. Susan walked over to the counter and took a seat beside me, her presence comforting in its familiarity. "You don't have to carry it all by yourself, you know," she said gently. "Whatever it is, you can talk to us. We're here for you." Her words hit me like a ton of bricks. I had spent so long trying to be strong, trying to prove that I could handle everything on my own, that I had forgotten what it felt like to lean on someone else. Tears welled up in my eyes, and before I knew it, I was pouring out everything: my fears, my doubts, the memories that I had tried so hard to bury. Susan listened quietly, not interrupting, just letting me speak until there was nothing left to say. When I finally finished, she reached out and took my hand, squeezing it gently. "You've been through so much," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "But you're not alone anymore. You have us, you have Matt, and you have this." She gestured around the shop, her eyes filled with pride. "You've built something amazing here. Don't let the past take that away from you." I nodded, unable to speak. In that moment, I realized that she was right. I had spent so long running from my past that I'd forgotten to appreciate the present, the life that I had created for myself with the help of the people who cared about me. Over the next few weeks, I began to let go of the fear that had held me captive for so long. I allowed myself to be happy, to enjoy the success of our business and the relationships that I had built. I started seeing a therapist, someone who helped me work through the trauma of my childhood and gave me the tools I needed to move forward. As the months passed, forgotten treasures continued to grow. We expanded into a larger space, hired more employees, and even started an online store to reach customers beyond our small town. Matt, Emily, and I worked tirelessly to ensure that our business thrived, but we also made time to enjoy the fruits of our labor. We would often spend our evenings sitting around the large wooden table in the back of the shop, talking and laughing as we planned for the future. Matt had a knack for finding new opportunities, always coming up with ideas for how we could grow the business. Emily, with her sharp eye for detail, kept us grounded, making sure we didn't take on more than we could handle. And then there was me, finally able to see the good in my life, finally able to believe that I deserved the happiness I had found. It wasn't all smooth sailing, of course. There were setbacks, times when I wondered if we had bitten off more than we could chew. There were arguments, disagreements about the direction the business should take or how to handle certain situations. But through it all, we stuck together, knowing that we were stronger as a team than we could ever be alone. One of the most memorable events happened during our second year in business. We had acquired a particularly rare and valuable piece of antique grandfather clock from the 18th century. It was a stunning piece, with intricate carvings and a history that traced back to a prominent family in England. We had planned to display the clock in a prominent spot in the shop, hoping to attract a buyer who would appreciate its value. But before we could even get it set up, disaster struck. One evening, as we were closing up for the night, a group of teenagers broke into the shop looking for something to steal. They didn't take much, just a few small items, but in their haste, they knocked over the grandfather clock, shattering the glass and damaging the woodwork. When we arrived at the shop the next morning and saw the damage, I was devastated. It felt like all our hard work had been for nothing, like we had been robbed of something precious. Matt and Emily were just as upset, but instead of dwelling on the loss, they immediately set to work on figuring out how to fix the clock. With Emily's expertise in restoration and Matt's determination, we spent the next few weeks repairing the damage. It wasn't easy. There were moments when I thought we would never be able to restore it to its former glory, but eventually we did. The clock was as beautiful as ever, and when we finally sold it to a collector for a substantial sum, it felt like a victory, not just for the business, but for us as a team. That experience taught me something important, that no matter what life threw at us, we could handle it as long as we stuck together. It was a lesson that would carry us through many more challenges in the years to come. As our business grew, so did our personal lives. Matt met a girl named Rachel, a bright and bubbly art student who shared his passion for creativity. They quickly became inseparable, and it wasn't long before they were talking about getting married. Emily, too, found love with a history professor she had met through one of our antique dealers. I was happy for them, but there was still a part of me that felt like an outsider. like I was still waiting for the other shoe to drop. But life has a way of surprising you when you least expect it. One day while I was at the shop, a woman walked in, looking for a gift for her father. She was strikingly beautiful, with dark hair and green eyes that sparkled with curiosity. We struck up a conversation, and before I knew it, we had spent hours talking about everything from our favorite books to the history of the items in the shop. Her name was Anna, and she was a writer working on her first novel. There was something about her that drew me in, something that made me feel like I could finally be myself, without fear or reservation. We started dating, and before long, I found myself falling in love for the first time in my life. Anna was everything I had ever wanted: kind, intelligent, and full of life. She didn't just accept my past, she embraced it, understanding that it was a part of who I was, but not letting it define me. With her by my side, I felt like I could finally let go of the darkness that had followed me for so long. Our relationship grew quickly, and before long, we were talking about moving in together. It was a big step, one that scared me more than I wanted to admit, but with Anna, everything felt right. She understood my fears, my insecurities, and she never pressured me to move faster than I was comfortable with. The Carters were thrilled when they met Anna. Susan immediately took her under her wing, treating her like the daughter she had always wanted. Tom, in his usual quiet way, welcomed her into the family with open arms, giving her the same steady support he had given me. As the years went by, our lives continued to intertwine. Forgotten Treasures became more than just a business, it became a family, a place where we all belonged. Matt and Rachel got married in a beautiful ceremony that we held in the shop, surrounded by the antiques that had brought us together. Emily and her professor moved in together, and they continued to support the business in every way they could. Anna and I eventually moved into a house just outside of town, a cozy little place with a garden where she could write and I could relax. We spent our days building our lives together, supporting each other through the ups and downs that life inevitably brings. I often found myself thinking back to the scared, broken boy I had been, the one who had thought he was worthless, who had believed that he would never be loved. If only he could see me now, surrounded by people who cared about me, who saw me for who I really was, not who I had been forced to become. There were still moments when the past would creep up on me, when the shadows would threaten to overwhelm the light I had found. But those moments became fewer and farther between, replaced by the warmth of the love that surrounded me. One day, as I was closing up the shop, I found myself standing in front of the old photograph that had once haunted me. It was still there, framed and hanging on the wall, a reminder of the journey I had taken. But as I looked at it now, I no longer felt the sadness that had once gripped me. Instead, I felt a sense of peace, a sense of acceptance. Just when I thought I had finally moved on from the darkness of my past, life threw another curveball that I never saw coming. It had been a few years since Matt and I had established Forgotten Treasures as a thriving business, and I was happier than I had ever been. My life was finally on track. I had a loving partner in Anna, a strong friendship with Matt, and a new family with the Carters, who treated me like their own son. For the first time, I felt like I belonged. But then, out of nowhere, the ghosts of my past came knocking literally. It all started on a rainy afternoon. I was at the shop, going through some new inventory we had just acquired from an estate sale, when I noticed a couple standing outside the door, staring in through the glass. At first, I didn't recognize them. They were older, more worn than I remembered. But as the man's eyes met mine, a cold shiver ran down my spine. It was James and Linda, me adoptive parents, the ones who had made my childhood a living hell. I felt like I had been punched in the gut. What were they doing here? Why now, after all these years? My heart pounded in my chest as I watched them push open the door and step inside. Well, look who's doing well for himself, James sneered, his voice dripping with the same disdain I remembered all too well. I couldn't speak. My throat felt like it was closing up, and all the old fear came rushing back in an instant. But then I felt a hand on my shoulder. It was Matt. He had come up behind me, his presence steady and reassuring. "Is there something we can help you with?" Matt asked, his tone polite but firm. James ignored him, his eyes fixed on me. "We've been looking for you, boy. Didn't think you'd be hiding out in a place like this." "I'm not hiding," I managed to say, though my voice was shaky. "What do you want?" Linda, who had been silent until now, stepped forward. We're here to get what's ours. You think you can just walk away from your family and live this fancy life? We raised you, fed you, gave you a home, and now you owe us. I was stunned. The audacity of these people, who had done nothing but abuse me, coming here and demanding anything from me, it was almost laughable, if it hadn't been so terrifying. You've got to be kidding me, Matt said, stepping in front of me, his eyes blazing with anger. You think after what you did to him he owes you anything? You're out of your minds. James' face twisted in rage. Watch your mouth, kid. You don't know anything about us. I know enough, Matt shot back, and you need to leave before we call the cops. Linda sneered at us both. You're going to regret this. You'll see. With that, they turned and walked out, slamming the door behind them. I stood there, shaking, barely able to process what had just happened. What the hell was that about? Matt asked, turning to me. I don't know, I whispered, but it's not good. A few weeks passed, and I tried to put the encounter with James and Linda out of my mind. But then, one day, I received a letter in the mail. It was from a law firm I had never heard of, demanding that I appear in court. James and Linda were suing the Carters for what they claimed was cruel treatment and unlawful removal of me from their home. They were trying to argue that the Carters had somehow stolen me from them and had turned me against them. I was in shock. The idea that they could twist the truth in such a grotesque way, after everything they had done to me, was sickening. But the more I thought about it, the more determined I became to fight back. I wasn't that scared, broken kid anymore. I had people who loved me, people who would stand by me, and I wasn't going to let James and Linda take that away from me. The first person I called was Matt. He listened as I explained what was happening, and by the time I finished, he was as furious as I was. We're not going to let them get away with this, he said. I've got some contacts who might be able to help. We'll get the best lawyer we can find, and we'll make sure those bastards pay for what they did to you. True to his word, Matt quickly set up a meeting with one of the top lawyers in the state, a man named Richard Adams. Richard was a no-nonsense kind of guy, with a reputation for being ruthless in the courtroom. When we met with him, I could tell right away that he wasn't going to be intimidated by James and Linda's lies. They don't have a leg to stand on, Richard said, after I told him everything. But we need to be prepared for them to play dirty. People like that, they'll try to twist the truth, make themselves look like the victims. We'll need to be ready with evidence, witnesses, anything we can get to prove that you were the one who was abused, not the other way around. The weeks leading up to the trial were some of the most stressful of my life. Richard worked tirelessly, gathering every piece of evidence he could find to prove my case. He interviewed the Carters, who spoke about the state I had been in when I first came to live with them, the injuries, the trauma. He tracked down old neighbors who had heard the fights, seen the bruises. He even got in touch with the hospital where I had been treated after James's final attack on me. The doctors there still had records of my injuries, and they were more than willing to testify on my behalf. Matt was by my side every step of the way. He helped Richard track down anyone who could speak to what had happened to me, using his connections and resources to ensure that we had everything we needed to make our case airtight. He even managed to find a former teacher of mine, Mrs. Andrews, who remembered seeing signs of abuse when I was a child, but hadn't been able to do anything about it at the time. She agreed to testify, saying she had always regretted not speaking up sooner. Anna was my rock during this time. She kept me grounded, reminding me that I wasn't alone, that I had people who loved me, and who would support me no matter what. She helped me prepare for the trial, going over my testimony with me, helping me stay calm in the face of the anxiety that threatened to overwhelm me. When the day of the trial finally arrived, I felt like I was walking into a nightmare. The courthouse was cold and imposing, the kind of place that seemed designed to make you feel small and insignificant. But as I walked through the doors with Matt on one side and Anna on the other, I knew I wasn't going to let James and Linda intimidate me. Not anymore. The courtroom was packed with people, spectators, reporters, and of course, the lawyers and the judge. Judge Harriet Monroe was presiding over the case, a stern-looking woman with a reputation for being fair, but tough. As I took my seat at the defendant's table, I glanced over at James and Linda, who were sitting across from me with their lawyer, a slick-looking man in an expensive suit. They both looked smug, as if they were already planning how to spend the money they thought they would win from this case. The trial began with opening statements from both sides. Richard was calm and collected, laying out our case with precision and clarity. He spoke about the years of abuse I had suffered at the hands of James and Linda, the evidence we had to prove it, and the love and care I had received from the Carters. He made it clear that this case was not just about me, but about protecting the people who had saved me from a life of misery. James and Linda's lawyer, on the other hand, tried to paint a picture of a loving family that had been torn apart by the Carters. He claimed that James and Linda had done everything they could to provide for me, but that the Carters had manipulated me into turning against them. He argued that I was ungrateful, that I had been brainwashed into believing that my biological family was the enemy. It was hard to listen to, but I knew it was all part of their strategy. They were trying to make me doubt myself, to make the jury doubt me. But I wasn't going to let them. The first few days of the trial were grueling. Richard presented evidence after evidence, calling witnesses to testify about the abuse I had suffered. The doctors from the hospital spoke about the extent of my injuries, the old scars that were still visible on my body. Mrs. Andrews testified about the signs of abuse she had noticed when I was a child, and how she had always suspected something was wrong. The Carters took the stand as well, describing the state I had been in when I first came to live with them, the nightmares, the fear, and how I'd gradually begun to heal in their care. James and Linda, meanwhile, took every opportunity to twist the truth. They denied everything, claiming that the injuries had been accidents, that I had always been a troubled child who had a tendency to hurt myself. They portrayed themselves as loving parents who had done their best, only to be betrayed by a system that had taken their son away from them. But it was during my testimony that the truth really began to come out. Richard had prepared me for this, but nothing could have truly prepared me for the moment when I had to face James and Linda in court, to look them in the eye and tell the world what they had done to me. I took a deep breath as I sat down in the witness stand, the weight of everyone's eyes on me. Judge Monroe looked at me kindly, but there was no escaping the gravity of the situation. "Please state your name for the court," she said. I did as she asked, my voice surprisingly steady. Richard began his questioning, guiding me through my story, helping me to tell the court what had happened in a way that was clear and concise. I spoke about the beatings, the emotional abuse, the way James and Linda had made me feel like I was worthless. I described the night James had thrown me down the stairs, the broken arm that Linda had refused to take me to the hospital for. I told them about the final beating that had landed me in the hospital, how a neighbor had saved my life by calling the police. I spoke about the fear that had ruled my life for so long, and how the Carters had helped me find my way out of that darkness. As I spoke, I could see the expressions on the faces of the jury, the judge, and even some of the spectators. They were horrified, disgusted by what I had gone through. But most of all, they were angry at James and Linda for what they had done, and angry that they had the audacity to try and paint themselves as victims. When Richard was finished with his questions, it was James and Linda's lawyer's turn. He was ruthless, trying to discredit everything I had said, trying to make it seem like I was exaggerating, like I was just a bitter, angry kid looking for someone to blame. But I held my ground. I didn't let him shake me, didn't let him twist my words. I answered his questions calmly and truthfully, refusing to let him drag me down to his level. When the lawyer finally gave up, I felt a surge of relief. I had done it. I had faced my abusers and told the world the truth. The final day of the trial was a blur. Richard gave his closing arguments, reminding the jury of all the evidence they had seen, all the testimony they had heard. He made it clear that this case wasn't just about me, but about justice, about making sure that people like James and Linda couldn't get away with abusing their children and then trying to profit from it. James and Linda's lawyer tried to make one last plea, but it was clear that the jury wasn't buying it. They had seen through the lies, seen the truth for what it was. When the jury came back with their verdict, I could barely breathe. My heart was pounding in my chest as the foreman stood up to read the decision. "We find the defendants guilty on all counts." The words hit me like a wave, and I felt a surge of emotion that I hadn't expected. It was over. After all these years, I had finally won. I had finally put my past behind me. But the judge wasn't finished yet. Judge Monroe looked at James and Linda with a stern expression, her voice firm as she handed down their sentence. For the years of abuse inflicted upon your son, and for the attempt to manipulate this court and the legal system for your own gain, I hereby sentence you each to 15 years in prison. There was a collective gasp in the courtroom, followed by a stunned silence. James and Linda's faces went pale, the smugness wiped away in an instant. They looked at each other, then back at me, as if they couldn't believe what had just happened. But it was real. They were going to prison, and for the first time in my life, I felt truly free. After the trial, there was a sense of closure that I hadn't expected. The fear, the anxiety that had haunted me for so long, began to fade away. I knew it wouldn't disappear overnight, but for the first time, I felt like I could move forward without looking over my shoulder. Matt and I celebrated the victory with the Carters and Anna. We had a small gathering at the shop, just the people who had stood by me through it all. We laughed, we toasted, and for the first time I felt like I was surrounded by real family, the kind that loved and supported each other no matter what. As the evening wound down, Matt pulled me aside. "You did it, man," he said, clapping me on the shoulder. "You stood up to them, and you won. I'm proud of you." "I couldn't have done it without you," I replied, my voice thick with emotion. "You've always been there for me, even when I didn't deserve it." Matt shook his head. "You've always deserved it, and now you can finally live your life without them hanging over you." He was right. The future was wide open, and for the first time, I was ready to embrace it. Over the next few months, life slowly returned to normal. Forgotten treasures continued to thrive, and I threw myself into the business with renewed energy. Anna and I grew closer, and we started talking about taking the next step in our relationship. Matt and Rachel were planning their wedding, and I was excited to be a part of it. But more than anything, I was finally at peace with my past. I knew that the scars would always be there, but they didn't define me anymore. I was stronger than my past, stronger than the people who had tried to break me. And with the support of my family and friends, I knew I could face whatever challenges lay ahead.